It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation and fun for the group of 6 friends who had decided to camp by Blackwater Lake. The dense forest surrounding the lake was said to be haunted, but they dismissed the stories as mere local folklore meant to scare away tourists. The group consisted of Alex, the adventurous leader, Lisa, his girlfriend who loved photography, Mark and Sarah, a couple who enjoyed nature, and the twins, Tom and Jerry, who were always up for an adventure. The first night, as they sat around the campfire, Mark brought up the legend of Blackwater Lake. According to local legend, a witch had been drowned in the lake centuries ago, and her spirit still haunted the waters, cursing anyone who dared to disturb her peace. Alex laughed it off, calling it a silly ghost story, but Lisa felt a chill run down her spine as she listened. That night, as they slept in their tents, Lisa woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but distinct enough to make her heart race. She stepped out of the tent and saw a faint figure standing by the lake, looking straight at her. She froze, unable to move, until the figure slowly faded away. Shaken, she went back to the tent, convincing herself it was just a dream. The next morning, Lisa found strange markings around their campsite. Symbols and signs that none of them could decipher. Alex shrugged it off as the work of mischievous locals, but the others were less convinced. Throughout the day, an eerie feeling lingered, as if they were being watched. As night fell again, the group decided to explore the forest around the lake. Armed with flashlights, they ventured deeper into the woods. The deeper they went, the more uneasy they felt. The trees seemed to close in on them, and the sounds of the forest grew louder and more menacing. Suddenly, they came across an old, abandoned cabin. Its windows were boarded up, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate. Inside, they found old furniture covered in dust, and strange symbols carved into the walls. In the corner, they discovered an ancient-looking book. Sarah, who could read Latin, realized it was a book of spells and curses. Before they could react, the door slammed shut, and they heard the same whispering Lisa had heard the night before. The temperature dropped, and an oppressive darkness filled the cabin. The friends huddled together, terrified, as the whispers grew louder and more intense. Mark, in a desperate attempt to escape, kicked the door open, and they all ran out into the forest. But the forest seemed different now, more sinister. The trees twisted and turned, and the path back to the campsite seemed to have disappeared. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. As they wandered, they stumbled upon an old graveyard. The tombstones were covered in moss, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. In the center of the graveyard stood a large, ominous tree. Tied to its trunk was a tattered piece of cloth, the same color as the figure's dress Lisa had seen the night before. Suddenly, the ground beneath them started to tremble, and the whispers turned into a deafening chorus of screams. The tree's branches reached out like skeletal arms, and from the ground emerged the ghostly figure of the witch, her eyes burning with rage. She pointed a bony finger at them, and one by one, they felt an invisible force choking the life out of them. As Lisa's vision blurred and darkness consumed her, she realized the legend was true. The Witch of Blackwater Lake had claimed yet another group of souls, and their screams would join the haunting whispers that would forever echo through the forest. Whispering Pines had always been a popular spot for campers looking to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Surrounded by towering pine trees and majestic mountains, it was the perfect place for a weekend getaway. This particular weekend, a group of 5 university friends decided to pitch their tents and enjoy the beauty of nature. There was Ethan, the group's outdoor enthusiast, Rebecca, the history major, Jake, the joker of the group, Emily, who loved writing, and Hannah, the quiet artist. As they set up camp, Rebecca couldn't help but notice a strange, ancient-looking totem pole standing near their site. Covered in carvings and symbols, it seemed out of place in the otherwise serene landscape. When she asked the park ranger about it, he looked uneasy and advised them to stay away from it, mentioning that it was part of a Native American legend best left undisturbed. The first night went by peacefully. They sang songs, roasted marshmallows, and shared ghost stories around the campfire. But the next day, things began to take a turn. Emily, who had wandered off to find inspiration for her writing, came back with tales of strange whispers she heard in the forest. Jake laughed it off, calling it her overactive imagination, but Ethan and Rebecca were intrigued. That evening, they all heard it, faint, melodic whispers that seemed to come from the totem pole. Ethan suggested they investigate, despite Hannah's protests. As they approached the totem pole, the whispers grew louder, almost beckoning them closer. Suddenly, the ground shook, and a chill ran through the air. The friends were frozen in place as the totem pole seemed to come to life. The carved faces twisted into expressions of anguish and despair. From the darkness emerged a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It was the spirit of an ancient shaman, angry and vengeful. The shaman spoke in a language they couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. They had trespassed on sacred ground. Ethan tried to apologize, but the spirit was not appeased. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like the cries of lost souls. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees bending and groaning under an unseen force. Rebecca, remembering the ranger's words, tried to plead with the spirit, explaining that they meant no harm. The shaman's eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of understanding. But then, the ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a chasm of darkness. The spirit's hand shot out, grabbing Ethan and dragging him towards the abyss. Panic ensued as the friends tried to pull Ethan back. Jake, in a desperate bid to save his friend, threw himself at the spirit, but was swatted away like a rag doll. Emily and Hannah screamed for help, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness. Rebecca, thinking quickly, grabbed a handful of pine needles and threw them into the fire they had built earlier. The flames roared to life, and for a moment, the spirit recoiled. Taking advantage of the distraction, the friends managed to pull Ethan free and ran back to their campsite. They didn't stop running until they reached the ranger station. Breathless and terrified, they recounted their ordeal. The ranger listened, a grave expression on his face, and then led them to a small, hidden shrine near the campsite. He performed an ancient ritual, asking the spirits for forgiveness and protection. That night, the friends huddled together in the ranger's cabin, too scared to return to their tents. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of the shaman's eyes haunted their dreams. The next morning, they packed up and left Whispering Pines, vowing never to return. As they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And every now and then, in the quiet of the night, they would hear faint whispers, reminding them of the spirits they had disturbed and the price they had almost paid. For the Hardy family, the annual camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains was a cherished tradition. This year, they had chosen a new, more remote spot, eager to explore uncharted territory. Mike and Linda Hardy, along with their teenage children, Sarah and Josh, were seasoned campers and looked forward to a week of hiking, fishing, and bonding away from the distractions of modern life. Their campsite was perfect, nestled between towering pines and near a crystal-clear stream. The first few days were idyllic. They hiked through breathtaking landscapes, fished in the stream, and sat around the campfire sharing stories. On the fourth day, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The structure was weathered and overgrown, and there was an eerie silence around it. Mike suggested they explore it, thinking it could be a fun adventure. Sarah and Josh were excited, but Linda felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Inside, the cabin was musty and filled with old, decaying furniture. They found strange symbols carved into the walls and a diary on a dusty table. The diary belonged to a man named Elias, who had lived there decades ago. His entries spoke of a shadowy presence that haunted him, driving him to madness. As they read, the air grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell over the cabin. Linda insisted they leave, and reluctantly, they agreed. That night, as they sat around the campfire, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first sign of trouble came when Josh disappeared. He had gone to collect firewood and never returned. Panic set in as they searched the surrounding area, calling his name. Hours passed with no sign of him. Exhausted and terrified, they huddled together, hoping he would find his way back. In the middle of the night, they heard footsteps outside their tents. Mike grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, only to find the shadowy figure from the diary standing at the edge of their campsite. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it whispered Josh's name in a voice that was both familiar and otherworldly. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a sense of dread. The next morning, they resumed their search for Josh. They found him near the old cabin, dazed and confused, with no memory of how he got there. He spoke of a voice that lured him into the woods, promising to reunite him with someone he couldn't quite remember. Determined to leave, the Hardys packed up their campsite, but the shadowy figure followed them, always just out of sight. They drove to the nearest town and reported their encounter to the authorities, who dismissed it as stress and exhaustion. Back home, the haunting continued. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and they heard whispers at night. Josh's condition worsened, and he started to withdraw, speaking in the same strange voice that had lured him away. Desperate for answers, Linda researched the cabin and discovered that Elias had gone mad and killed his family, believing they were possessed by the shadows. The cabin had been abandoned ever since, and locals believed it was cursed. Realizing they had to break the curse, the Hardys returned to the Sierra Nevada with a local shaman. They performed a ritual at the cabin, asking the spirits for forgiveness and to release Josh from their grasp. As the ritual ended, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Josh slowly recovered, and the haunting ceased, but the memory of their encounter remained. The Hardys never spoke of that trip again, but they knew they had come dangerously close to losing everything to the shadows of the Sierra Nevada. Devil's Ridge was notorious among hikers and campers for its treacherous terrain and eerie atmosphere. Despite the warnings, a group of thrill-seeking college students decided to test their mettle against the ridge. The group included James, the fearless leader, his girlfriend, Megan, their friends, Luke, Ashley, and Matt, and Katie, the skeptic who never believed in ghost stories. The journey to the campsite was arduous, with steep climbs and narrow paths. By the time they set up camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the ridge. As they sat around the campfire, James told the legend of Devil's Ridge, a story about a phantom that haunted the area, seeking revenge on those who dared to disturb its resting place. Katie scoffed, dismissing it as a mere scare tactic to keep people away. But as night fell, an unsettling feeling crept over them. The wind howled through the trees, and strange sounds echoed in the darkness. That night, James woke to the sound of someone crying. He stepped out of his tent and saw a faint light flickering in the distance. Curious, he followed the light to a small clearing where he found an old gravestone, barely visible under the moonlight. The crying stopped, and the air grew icy cold. He turned to leave, but a ghostly figure appeared before him, a woman in tattered clothes, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She reached out to him, whispering words he couldn't understand. Terrified, James ran back to the campsite, but the figure followed, her presence growing stronger with each step. Back at the campsite, the others woke up to James's frantic screams. He told them about the ghost, but Katie remained skeptical, insisting it was a trick of the light. However, as the night wore on, they all began to see the phantom, her mournful eyes watching them from the darkness. The next day, they decided to leave, but the ridge seemed determined to keep them. The paths twisted and turned, leading them in circles. No matter which direction they took, they always ended up back at the gravestone. Desperate, they decided to confront the phantom. Megan, who had a keen interest in history, suggested they find out more about the gravestone. They discovered it belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had been accused of witchcraft and murdered by the townsfolk centuries ago. Her restless spirit had haunted Devil's Ridge ever since. Realizing they needed to help Eleanor find peace, they gathered around the gravestone and held a séance. They asked for her forgiveness and promised to tell her story so that she would not be forgotten. As they spoke, the wind died down, and a calmness settled over the ridge. The phantom appeared one last time, her expression softening. She whispered her thanks and vanished into the night. The next morning, the path down the ridge was clear, and the oppressive feeling was gone. James, Megan, Luke, Ashley, Matt, and even Katie, who had become a believer, left Devil's Ridge, knowing they had done the right thing. They told Eleanor's story to anyone who would listen, ensuring her spirit could finally rest in peace. Silverwood Forest was known for its towering trees and serene beauty, attracting campers from all over. This summer, a family of 4, Tom and Mary, along with their children, Jack and Emma, decided to spend a week in this idyllic setting. They were seasoned campers and looked forward to a peaceful retreat. The first few days were perfect. They hiked through the forest, swam in the nearby river, and enjoyed the tranquility. But on the third night, things took a sinister turn. As they sat around the campfire, they heard rustling in the bushes. Tom assumed it was a deer, but the sound was followed by an unsettling silence. That night, Mary woke up to a strange sensation, as if someone was watching her. She looked out of the tent and saw a figure standing at the edge of their campsite. It was tall and shadowy, with eyes that glowed a menacing red. She screamed, waking the others, but the figure vanished. Tom searched the area, but found nothing. He assured Mary it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The next day, they found strange symbols carved into the trees around their campsite. Jack and Emma, curious and fearless, tried to decipher them, but they made no sense. As night fell, the atmosphere grew tense. The family huddled together in their tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the trees. It was followed by a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. Tom grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. The light flickered, and the batteries died, leaving him in complete darkness. He heard footsteps approaching and felt a cold breath on his neck. Panicking, he ran back to the tent, but the entity followed. Mary and the children watched in horror as the tent was ripped open by invisible claws. The entity, now fully visible, was a grotesque creature with elongated limbs and sharp teeth. It lunged at Tom, but he managed to fend it off with a burning log from the campfire. Realizing they couldn't stay, the family grabbed what they could and ran through the forest. The entity chased them, its growls echoing in the night. They reached the river and crossed it, hoping the water would deter the creature. It stopped at the edge, its red eyes glaring at them with fury. They made it to a ranger station at dawn, exhausted and terrified. The rangers listened to their story, their faces growing pale. They explained that the forest was believed to be haunted by an ancient entity, a guardian spirit that had turned malevolent over time. Many campers had reported similar encounters, but none had been as close as the Hardys. The rangers performed a cleansing ritual to protect the family, but warned them never to return to Silverwood Forest. Grateful and shaken, they headed home, knowing they had narrowly escaped a deadly encounter. The memory of the entity haunted their dreams, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked in the heart of Silverwood Forest. Willow Creek was a small, sleepy town with a dark past. Decades ago, a tragic accident had claimed the lives of several children at a summer camp near the creek. The camp was shut down, and the area was left abandoned, becoming overgrown and forgotten. But the locals whispered that the spirits of the children still haunted the area. Despite the warnings, a group of friends decided to camp near Willow Creek, eager to explore the haunted grounds. There was David, the thrill seeker, his sister, Laura, her boyfriend, Sam, and their friends, Rachel and Ben. They arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, excited but wary. As they set up camp, they noticed old, dilapidated cabins hidden among the trees. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and an unsettling silence hung over the area. That night, as they sat around the campfire, David suggested they explore the old campgrounds. Laura was hesitant, but the others agreed. With flashlights in hand, they ventured into the darkness. The cabins were eerily preserved, with toys and belongings left behind as if the children had just vanished. Rachel found an old journal that belonged to one of the campers, detailing the days leading up to the accident. The last entry spoke of strange sightings and voices in the night. As they explored further, they heard the sound of children laughing and playing. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, surrounding them. The laughter turned to cries for help, and the air grew cold. Panic set in as they realized the spirits of the children were still there, reliving their final moments. The friends ran back to their campsite, but the haunting followed them. Shadows moved among the trees, and ghostly figures appeared at the edge of the firelight. Laura, who had always been sensitive to the supernatural, felt a cold hand grasp hers. She looked down and saw a ghostly child looking up at her with pleading eyes. Desperate to escape, they decided to leave immediately. But as they packed up, their car wouldn't start. The laughter and cries grew louder, and the temperature plummeted. David, in a moment of desperation, remembered an old legend about the creek. It was said that the only way to appease the spirits was to offer them something precious. He took his sister's locket, a cherished family heirloom, and placed it at the edge of the creek. The water rippled, and the cries ceased. The ghostly figures faded, and the car started up. They drove away, not daring to look back. Back in town, they spoke to an elderly local who confirmed the legend. The spirits of Willow Creek were children who had died tragically and were trapped in a loop of their final moments. By offering the locket, they had given the spirits something to hold on to, allowing them to find peace. The friends never returned to Willow Creek, but they would never forget the night they encountered the ghosts of the haunted camp. And every now and then, they would hear the faint sound of children laughing in the distance, a reminder of the spirits that lingered by the creek. Ravenwood Camp had been closed for decades, its gates locked and its grounds overgrown with weeds. Once a thriving summer camp, it had been abandoned after a series of mysterious disappearances. The locals believed the camp was cursed, and the stories of the missing children became part of local folklore. Despite the warnings, a group of urban explorers decided to spend the weekend at Ravenwood, determined to uncover its secrets. The group included Max, the leader, his girlfriend, Chloe, their friends, Dylan, Erica, and Jason, and Mia, who was documenting their adventure for her blog. They arrived at Ravenwood just before sunset. The dilapidated cabins and overgrown paths gave the camp an eerie, haunting beauty. As they set up camp, Max shared the legend of Ravenwood, a story about a vengeful spirit known as the Raven, who supposedly haunted the camp and preyed on unsuspecting campers. That night, they gathered around a makeshift campfire and told ghost stories, but the atmosphere was tense. As the firelight flickered, Mia noticed shadows moving among the trees. She dismissed it as her imagination, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the middle of the night, Erica woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her tent. She peeked out and saw a shadowy figure standing near the old campfire, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. She screamed, waking the others, but the figure vanished before they could see it. The next morning, they found strange symbols etched into the ground around their campsite. Dylan, who had a knack for the occult, recognized them as protection symbols, but they were incomplete. He suggested they find the source of the symbols to complete the protection. As they explored the camp, they discovered an old, hidden cabin deep in the woods. Inside, they found more symbols and an ancient book of spells. The book contained a ritual to ward off evil spirits, but it required a personal item from each of them. That night, they gathered their items and performed the ritual. As they chanted the incantation, the wind picked up and the air grew cold. The ground trembled, and a dark figure appeared before them, the raven. It was a tall, menacing spirit with dark feathers and glowing red eyes. The raven screeched, a sound that echoed through the forest, and lunged at them. The protection symbols glowed, creating a barrier that held the spirit at bay. But the ritual wasn't complete. They needed one more item, a personal sacrifice. Max, realizing they had no other choice, took off his locket, a gift from his late grandmother, and placed it in the center of the symbols. The locket glowed, and the raven screeched in agony before vanishing into the night. The air grew still, and the oppressive feeling lifted. They had successfully banished the spirit, but at a great cost. The friends packed up and left Ravenwood, vowing never to return. Mia documented their experience, but out of respect for the victims, never published the story. The legend of Ravenwood lived on, but the camp remained abandoned, a silent testament to the spirits that once haunted its grounds. Shadow Peak was a challenging and remote location, attracting only the most experienced hikers and campers. Its rugged terrain and breathtaking views were worth the effort, but few dared to camp there due to the rumors of a wraith that haunted the peak. A group of friends, eager for adventure, decided to take on the challenge. Sarah, an experienced hiker, her boyfriend, Mike, their friends, Jess, Tom, and Eric, and Lily, who was new to camping but excited to join. They reached the peak after a grueling hike and set up their campsite, ready to enjoy the solitude and beauty. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and an eerie silence settled over the peak. They sat around the campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the clear, starry night. But as the fire began to die down, they noticed a figure standing on a nearby ridge, silhouetted against the sky. Jess, always curious, suggested they investigate. Despite Lily's protests, they grabbed their flashlights and made their way to the ridge. The figure was gone, but they found an old, weathered journal half buried in the dirt. It belonged to a man named Daniel, who had camped on Shadow Peak years ago. The journal detailed Daniel's encounter with the wraith, a malevolent spirit that preyed on the living, feeding on their fear and despair. His last entry was a desperate plea for help, followed by pages of frantic, illegible scrawls. As they read, a cold wind howled through the trees, and they heard the faint sound of wailing. They rushed back to their campsite, but the wailing followed them. The fire, which they had left burning, was now out, and the temperature plummeted further. Suddenly, the wraith appeared before them, a ghostly figure with hollow eyes and a tattered cloak, its face twisted in a permanent scream. It reached out with bony fingers, and the friends felt an overwhelming sense of dread and hopelessness. Sarah, remembering a passage from the journal, realized they needed to confront the wraith and banish it with light. She grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly at the wraith, but the batteries died. Mike quickly lit a flare, and the wraith recoiled, its screams echoing through the night. They surrounded the wraith with their remaining flares, forming a circle of light. The wraith writhed and screamed, its form becoming less distinct. Sarah recited a banishment spell from the journal, and with one final, deafening scream, the wraith dissolved into the night. The friends stood in stunned silence, the oppressive feeling lifting as the first light of dawn broke over the peak. Exhausted but relieved, they packed up and made their way down the mountain. They returned to civilization with a newfound respect for the supernatural and the power of light against darkness. The story of their encounter with the Wraith of Shadow Peak spread, warning others of the dangers that lurked in the remote wilderness. Deadwood Swamp was a place shrouded in mystery and superstition. The locals avoided it, speaking of strange occurrences and the eerie silence that enveloped the area. Despite the warnings, a group of 5 friends decided to camp there, intrigued by the tales of the supernatural. The group consisted of Alex, a nature enthusiast, his girlfriend, Lisa, their friends, Mark and Sarah, and Chris, who was always up for a spooky adventure. They arrived at the swamp in the late afternoon, the air thick with humidity and the smell of decay. As they set up camp, the silence was almost deafening. There were no sounds of birds or insects, just an oppressive stillness that made them uneasy. Alex brushed it off, eager to explore the swamp and its mysteries. That night, as they sat around the campfire, they heard a distant, haunting melody. It was faint, almost like a lullaby, and it seemed to come from deep within the swamp. Lisa suggested they follow the sound, hoping to find its source. The others agreed, though Chris was hesitant. They made their way through the murky waters, the melody growing louder and more eerie. They reached a clearing and found an old, crumbling mansion partially submerged in the swamp. The melody was coming from inside, and a faint light flickered in one of the windows. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to enter the mansion. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The walls were covered in vines, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. They followed the sound to a grand piano in the parlor, where a ghostly figure played the haunting tune. The figure looked up, and they saw it was a woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She stopped playing and beckoned them closer. Mark, who had a keen interest in the supernatural, stepped forward and asked who she was. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn, a former resident of the mansion. She explained that she had been trapped in the swamp for centuries, cursed to play the piano for eternity. Her family had been accused of witchcraft and drowned in the swamp, and she was the only one left. Evelyn begged for their help, asking them to find her family's graves and perform a ritual to break the curse. Moved by her story, they agreed. She gave them a map and instructions for the ritual before fading away. The friends followed the map to a hidden part of the swamp, where they found the graves of Evelyn's family. As they began the ritual, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence returned. Shadows moved among the trees, and they felt a sense of dread. They completed the ritual, and the ground shook as the spirits of Evelyn's family rose from their graves. The spirits surrounded them, their eyes filled with gratitude. Evelyn appeared, her form more solid, and thanked them for freeing her family. As the sun rose, the spirits faded, and the oppressive silence lifted. The swamp seemed more alive, with the sounds of birds and insects returning. The friends returned to their campsite, exhausted but relieved. They left Deadwood Swamp, knowing they had done something important. The story of their encounter with Evelyn and her family became a local legend, a reminder of the power of the supernatural and the importance of compassion. Black Hollow Forest was known for its dense trees and labyrinthine paths. It was a place few dared to enter, shrouded in legends of disappearances and eerie occurrences. A group of friends, eager for a thrill, decided to camp there, determined to uncover its secrets. The group included Rachel, a fearless explorer, her boyfriend, Jack, their friends, Emily and Tom, and Chris, who was always up for a challenge. They reached the forest in the late afternoon, the thick canopy casting long shadows on the ground. As they set up camp, they noticed the forest was unusually quiet. There were no sounds of birds or animals, just an oppressive stillness. Rachel, excited by the prospect of an adventure, suggested they explore the forest before nightfall. They ventured deeper into the forest, following a narrow path that twisted and turned. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air grew colder. They found an old, abandoned cabin and decided to investigate. Inside, the cabin was filled with old, dusty furniture and strange symbols carved into the walls. They found a journal belonging to a man named Edward, who had lived there years ago. The journal detailed his encounters with a dark entity that haunted the forest, driving him to madness. As they read, they heard a low growl coming from outside. The air grew colder, and the ground shook. They rushed back to their campsite, but the feeling of dread followed them. That night, as they sat around the campfire, they saw shadows moving among the trees. The entity revealed itself, a dark, hulking figure with glowing red eyes and sharp claws. It moved silently, stalking them from the darkness. The friends tried to fend it off, but it was too powerful. It seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. Rachel, remembering the journal, realized they needed to find the source of the entity's power. They returned to the cabin, and found an old, hidden basement. Inside, they discovered a shrine with dark artifacts and symbols of power. Tom, who had some knowledge of the occult, suggested they destroy the shrine to weaken the entity. As they began to dismantle it, the entity attacked, its rage palpable. Jack fought it off, while the others worked quickly to destroy the artifacts. With a final, deafening roar, the entity vanished, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The friends stood in stunned silence, the air growing warmer as the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. They had survived the night, but the memory of the entity haunted them. They left Black Hollow Forest, knowing they had faced true horror. The story of their encounter spread, warning others of the dangers that lurked in the dense, dark woods. And though they vowed never to return, the forest remained, a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded within its depths. These 10 stories capture different aspects of terror in various camping settings across the United States. Each story is unique, with its own set of characters and supernatural elements, ensuring a diverse and thrilling reading experience. Crystal Lake was known for its clear waters and serene beauty, a perfect getaway for campers seeking peace and quiet. This weekend, 4 friends, Emma, her boyfriend Liam, their friend Olivia, and Olivia's brother Ethan, decided to escape the city and unwind at this idyllic spot. They arrived in the early afternoon and set up their tents near the shore. The lake was calm, reflecting the surrounding mountains and trees like a mirror. As the sun set, they lit a campfire and sat around, enjoying the tranquility. As night fell, Olivia suggested they go for a swim. The water was cold but refreshing, and they laughed and splashed, feeling carefree. But as they swam, Emma noticed something strange. A dark figure appeared beneath the water, moving towards them. She screamed, and they all rushed back to the shore. Liam reassured them that it was probably just their imagination, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling of dread. That night, as they slept, strange things began to happen. Emma woke to the sound of whispering, but when she looked around, there was no one there. Olivia had nightmares about drowning and woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, they found strange markings in the sand around their campsite. They looked like symbols, but none of them could decipher their meaning. Ethan, who had read about the local folklore, mentioned a legend about a girl named Abigail who had drowned in the lake years ago. It was said that her spirit still haunted the waters, seeking revenge on those who disturbed her rest. Despite their growing unease, they decided to stay another night. As dusk approached, they noticed a dense fog rolling in from the lake, making it difficult to see. The whispers grew louder, and they saw shadows moving in the mist. Suddenly, the figure of a young girl appeared at the water's edge. Her dress was tattered, and her eyes were filled with sorrow. She pointed towards the lake, and they heard a mournful wail. Olivia, feeling a strange compulsion, walked towards the water, but Liam grabbed her just in time. Realizing they needed to leave, they hurriedly packed up their campsite. But as they tried to drive away, their car wouldn't start. The fog grew thicker, and the temperature dropped. They saw Abigail's spirit in the rearview mirror, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Emma, desperate to appease the spirit, remembered a passage from a book about local legends. She took a piece of jewelry, a bracelet her grandmother had given her, and placed it at the water's edge as an offering. The fog began to lift, and the whispers faded. The car started, and they drove away, not daring to look back. They left Crystal Lake, vowing never to return. The story of their encounter with Abigail became a warning to others, a reminder of the vengeful spirit that haunted the lake. Redwood Valley was famous for its towering trees and scenic hiking trails. It was a paradise for nature lovers and adventure seekers. This weekend, a group of hikers, Jessica, her husband Matt, their friend Greg, and Greg's sister Kate, decided to explore a lesser-known trail rumored to be cursed. They arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, eager to start their adventure. The trail was overgrown and rarely used, adding to its mystique. As they hiked deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, and an eerie silence settled over the group. They reached a clearing where they found an old, crumbling stone altar covered in moss and vines. Jessica, who was fascinated by ancient rituals, examined the altar and found strange symbols carved into the stone. Greg, always the skeptic, dismissed it as an old relic and suggested they move on. As they continued their hike, they began to feel an oppressive presence. The air grew colder, and they heard whispers among the trees. Matt noticed that their GPS was acting strange, the compass spinning wildly. They realized they were lost. The sun began to set, and they decided to set up camp in the clearing. That night, as they sat around the campfire, they heard footsteps and rustling in the bushes. Kate screamed as she saw a pair of glowing eyes watching them from the darkness. The figure emerged, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. The man introduced himself as Caleb, a former guide who had disappeared years ago. He warned them that the trail was cursed and that they needed to leave immediately. Before they could react, he vanished into the night. Panicked, they tried to find their way back to the main trail, but the forest seemed to shift and change around them. The whispers grew louder, and they felt an invisible force pushing them towards the altar. Jessica realized that the symbols on the altar were part of a binding spell, trapping restless spirits in the area. Desperate to break the curse, she suggested they perform a cleansing ritual. Using items they had with them, they recreated the symbols in reverse, chanting words of release and forgiveness. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. Suddenly, the spirits of the forest appeared, ghostly figures of lost hikers and Caleb among them. The spirits surrounded the altar, their expressions filled with anguish. As Jessica completed the ritual, the spirits began to fade, their whispers turning into sighs of relief. The forest grew still, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The path back to the main trail became clear, and they hurriedly made their way out of the valley. They returned home, shaken but relieved, and vowed never to speak of the cursed trail again. The legend of Redwood Valley remained, a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture too deep into the forest. The hikers knew they had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, and the memory of their encounter haunted their dreams. Shadow Creek was a hidden gem in the Ozark Mountains, known for its clear waters and lush surroundings. It was the perfect spot for a weekend camping trip. This time, for friends Brian, his girlfriend Megan, their friend Sam, and Sam's sister Lily, decided to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. They arrived at Shadow Creek in the late afternoon and set up their tents near the water. The forest was dense, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. As the sun set, they built a campfire and sat around, enjoying the peaceful ambience. As night fell, they heard strange noises coming from the forest. It sounded like a low growl, followed by the snapping of branches. Brian, always the adventurous one, suggested they investigate. Megan and Lily were hesitant, but Sam was eager to explore. They followed the sound deeper into the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The growling grew louder, and they stumbled upon a clearing where they found large, clawed footprints in the mud. Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, recognized them as bear tracks, but they seemed unusually large. Suddenly, they heard a roar, and a massive, shadowy figure emerged from the trees. It was a beast unlike anything they had ever seen, a creature with glowing red eyes, sharp claws, and a hulking form. The beast charged at them, and they ran back to their campsite in a panic. They huddled together, trying to make sense of what they had seen. Brian suggested they pack up and leave, but their car keys were missing. They realized that they were trapped. The beast circled their campsite, its growls growing louder and more menacing. Desperate to protect themselves, they built up the campfire and used sticks as makeshift weapons. The beast lurked at the edge of the firelight, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It lunged at them, but they managed to fend it off with the burning sticks. Megan, who had read about local legends, remembered a story about a cursed creature that haunted the Ozark Mountains. According to the legend, the beast was once a man who had been cursed by a witch for his cruelty. The only way to break the curse was to show the beast compassion. Despite their fear, Megan approached the beast, holding out a piece of food. The beast hesitated, its eyes flickering with a hint of recognition. She spoke softly, telling it they meant no harm. The beast growled and backed away, disappearing into the forest. The next morning, they found their car keys near the creek. Relieved, they packed up and left Shadow Creek, vowing never to return. The memory of the beast haunted them, but they took solace in the fact that they had shown it compassion. The legend of the beast of Shadow Creek remained, a warning to those who ventured into the Ozark Mountains. The friends knew they had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, and the experience brought them closer together.